Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for Ezekiel Solomon, Michigan's first Jewish settler, with Craig Wilson. As you can see on your screen, we have a lot of exciting upcoming programming, and you can visit www.mishjewishhistory.org/calendar to register. Additionally, if you have enjoyed our Zoom programming, we hope you will visit www.mishjewishhistory.org/donate to support our efforts. This evening, we are very excited to have with us Craig Wilson, Chief Curator with the Mackinac State Historic Parks, to discuss the life of Ezekiel Solomon, the man considered to be Michigan's first Jewish settler. Over 260 years ago, Solomon settled in northern Michigan and was among the merchants that lived there and participated in the fur trade that fueled the economy. Please give a warm welcome to Craig Wilson as he gives us a little bit of insight into Ezekiel Solomon's life.
Yeah, well, good evening, everyone, and thank you very much for having me. And let me just get my screen set up here so we can start to share. So yeah, as was just mentioned, I'm the chief curator for Mackinac State Historic Parks, which is a family of museums and historic sites in northern Michigan. And we're going to be talking specifically about one of the sites that we administer, and that's Michilimackinac, which is in what is today Mackinac City at the south end of the Mackinac Bridge, and specifically about Ezekiel Solomon, who again is widely considered to be the first Jewish resident of Michigan. And it's actually 260 years ago this year that he arrived here in northern Michigan. And that's kind of what prompted everything that we're going to be talking about tonight. The Historical Society reached out to us and asked if we'd be interested in doing something to commemorate that, commemorate Solomon's arrival. And that spurred a number of different things, including this presentation tonight. So this is an ongoing process that we're pretty excited to be involved with. But to get started, we're going to talk again a little about Michilimackinac. And hopefully some of you have been able to make it up here. We run our museum as Colonial Michilimackinac. Lots of people end up going over to Mackinac Island, where we have many of our other historic sites. But we're going to talk about Michilimackinac specifically. So again, this is right at the tip of the Lower Peninsula. Our visitor center, where you enter the site, is actually built into the foundations of the Mackinac Bridge. And what we have here today is a reconstruction, and we'll talk about why in a little while. But Michilimackinac, as a European community, began about 1715, so just under 300, or just over rather, 300 years ago. And it was built by the French government to serve as a trading center and a resupply point for the Great Lakes fur trade, the business that ran the economy of Michigan and the rest of the Great Lakes for about 200 years, and which Ezekiel Solomon was a very active participant in the mid to late 18th century. So what we're looking at here is a drawing of the fort from 1749. This is kind of the middle of the fort's lifespan. It had expanded pretty dramatically from when it was originally built in 1715. At that point, it was a small, there was actually a Jesuit mission here already. There was a very large Odawa community here already. So there was already a large indigenous population right here at the Straits. And there were just a couple of houses that those French soldiers built. But very quickly, within about 10 years, it expanded out to about what you're looking at on your screen right now, again, as the result of the fur trade. It's ideally located to be a center of the Great Lakes fur trade, because being up here on the Straits of Mackinac, where Lakes Michigan and Huron come together, you can go essentially anywhere you want in the Great Lakes by water. You can very easily get up into Lake Superior. The St. Mary's River is only about 40 miles away from here. Again, very easy to go really anywhere within the Great Lakes watershed from this spot. And again, this is also an ideal place to have a ready point of contact with the Anishinaabeg, the indigenous people of Michigan still today. You may know them better as the Ojibwa, the Odawa, or the Potawatomi. Together, those three groups of people make the Anishinaabeg. And so the French wanted to be out here to be close to them so they could participate in the fur trade. Now, again, it remained a French outpost for about 45 years until 1760. At that point, as a result of the 7 Years' War, what we call the French and Indian War here in North America, uh, all of Canada came under British control. And as we go forward, if I keep saying Canada, I'm not necessarily referring to the country that we know as Canada today. I'm referring to all of that plus most of the
Craig,
Great Lakes.
Craig, we are not seeing your slides.
Huh. Okay. It says I'm sharing my screen.
We see the Ezekiel Solomon, the blue,
Uh-huh.
but now we do. Thank you.
Okay. Everything good?
Yeah, everything's good now. Thank you.
Okay, great. Yeah, let me know if there's any more technical difficulties and I'll do what I can to address those. Yeah, in any case, Canada as it existed in the 18th century encompassed, again, most of what's today Michigan and parts of several other states. So just keep that in mind if I say that going forward. Again, all came under British control in 1760, but the British didn't actually get around to moving out here into the Great Lakes for about a year until 1761. And the people who were already here, all the French Canadians who were already out here at Michilimackinac, at Detroit, at Sault Ste. Marie, they didn't really go anywhere. The peace terms in Canada were very generous. It allowed them to stick around. It's just the French soldiers kind of got up and left. And so the first British troops came out here in 1761, and that's where we first encounter Ezekiel Solomon. Now, we unfortunately don't know a whole lot about his backstory and about his early life. We do know that he was from Berlin in what was then Prussia. We're not entirely sure when he was born, probably sometime in the 1730s, just based on what we know of his later life. He came to the American colonies, the British American colonies, in the 1750s to serve as a sutler to the British military. So essentially as kind of a civilian contractor, selling things directly to the soldiers. So that's everything from soap to combs to food, anything that the Army needed. There were always sutlers traveling with the Army providing those goods to them. So that was a pretty lucrative business. And Ezekiel Solomon appears to have been part of a large group of men from the German states, because again, Germany didn't really exist as a country at that point in time, but men from those German states who came to the American colonies, many of them Jewish, and they went into business more or less with one another. And as the war kind of wound down here in North America, it kept going in Europe for a few more years, but with the capture of Canada in 1760, things kind of started to wind down here. Solomon formed a loose partnership with a few other men, some of whom were his relatives. So you're looking at Levi Solomon or Levi Solomons, who was his cousin. This image is from about 1760. Another man named Chapman Abram, another named Benjamin Lyon, and another named Gershon Levy. And those five men formed, again, a loose partnership. It wasn't necessarily a company just yet. They didn't incorporate or anything like that. But it was this consortium of people who were all working together. And as you can see, they kind of fanned out. So Lyon stayed in Montreal. That's kind of another center of the Great Lakes fur trade. That's as far inland as you can come on the St. Lawrence River by ship. And so that's kind of the jumping off point for all sorts of things coming from all over the world. They'd be offloaded in Montreal and then transshipped to other smaller vessels to make it through the river system out here into the Great Lakes. But Lyon stayed there, and these other men fanned out across the European communities of the Great Lakes. So Solomon, his cousin, Levi Solomon, went to Fort Niagara, where there was a very large British presence at the mouth of the Niagara River. Chapman Abram came to Detroit, and then Solomon came up here. And Levi also probably came up here, but maybe not at first. And it's interesting, we don't know a whole lot about Gershon Levi. He actually kind of disappears from the historic record in just a couple of years, but he definitely was here in the 1760s, but probably not among the very first wave like Ezekiel Solomon was. Now, Solomon got out here in September of 1761. And he was one of three people, three British traders who came out here to Michilimackinac even before British troops arrived. So technically, it was kind of illegal for him to be out here. Solomon was joined by Alexander Henry, who somewhat famously later wrote a very popular book about his travels and adventures in the Canadas. And he specifically mentions being out here with Ezekiel Solomon. They didn't come out here together or anything like that. But he and another man named James Stanley Goddard were essentially the first British traders at Michilimackinac. There was still all of the French residents here, all the French traders. They hadn't gone anywhere. But you have these three quote unquote British traders here. Solomon always gets grouped in with the British residents of Michilimackinac, even though he was not from Britain. He was absolutely from Berlin. He's always just kind of lumped in with them. And so they got out here hoping to basically get the best trade deals. They knew that if they got out here first, they would have a jump on all of the trading that was going to start up in the summer of 1762. And so it appears to have been a relatively perilous journey. Again, we don't know a whole lot about how Solomon himself got out here, but Alexander Henry writes about having to basically come out here in disguise. He had to put aside his traditional British clothes and he had to dress as a French Canadian voyageur, which you see in the picture here. They had very distinctive styles of dress. And he said, it was very weird for him to put all of those clothes on. But that's what he needed to do to get out here to try and get the best business opportunities. When these three men get out here, again, they are the sole representatives of the British Empire at that point in time, and they have no official standing whatsoever. They get out here. The French Canadians were rather cool to them. The local Anishinaabe almost immediately called them into council and basically told them, look, you're new around here. We're the ones who run the show. So we are going to be setting the terms of trading. This is just a reminder that, this might be British territory on a map somewhere, but it's actually Anishinaabe territory because we are the people who are here. And so those first few councils, if you believe Henry, appear to have been a little tense, but things worked out, at least in the short term, very quickly. Solomon and these other two men started making new trading agreements with the Anishinaabe and with other indigenous people. British soldiers did eventually arrive a little bit later in 1761 to firmly establish British control here at Michilimackinac. Again, very quickly, Solomon was in business, not only as a merchant in the fur trade, and we'll talk about what that entails in just a minute. He was also continuing that business of supplying the army. There are various references to him acting as kind of a middleman. So he would buy, for instance, corn from the Odawa, who were living about 30 miles away from here at a place called L'Arbre Croche near what's now Harbor Springs today, and then selling that to the British military here, selling that to the commanding officer. And that is a very lucrative business, not just for Solomon, but for a variety of other merchants who are living and working here at Michilimackinac. So not only are they directly involved in the fur trade, buying and selling furs, they're also involved in the logistics of that operation, supporting other merchants, supporting other government operations, just so they could continue to operate out here, relying upon business relationships that people like Solomon had built with the Anishinaabe and other indigenous groups. So we've talked quite a bit about the fur trade. How does this work? and what would Solomon actually have been doing? And again, Solomon was by no means the only trader here. Again, he's one of the first. He's one of the first three out here. But very quickly, he was joined by several other merchants. And then, of course, there were all of the French-Canadian merchants who were already living and working out here. But the way this fur trade works, it's important to remember that this is truly a global enterprise. We tend to think it's the 18th century, things must have been very localized, very small scale, and people only knew what was in their immediate vicinity. You hear, oh, people never traveled more than like 10 miles from home. Most of that's not true. I mean, think about Solomon himself. He came across Europe, across the Atlantic, all the way up the St. Lawrence, all the way out here to Michilimackinac. And this is not where he stopped. He kept going at later points in his career. So people moved around a lot. It was a serious undertaking, and it took a while. It could take a couple of months to get across the Atlantic, but people were doing it regularly. And not only were people moving around with a pretty high degree of regularity, goods, materials were moving literally all over the world. And the fur trade was just one part of this large global economy. So as I mentioned, kind of the other anchor of the fur trade is Montreal. And again, that's because that's as far as you can come inland on the St. Lawrence River. So there would be ships coming from Europe, from all over the world, packed with all sorts of manufactured items. These are primarily coming from France and then later Great Britain. This is a colony of those countries, so that's where the bulk of this stuff is coming from. But it does truly end up coming from all over the world. So those manufactured items are everything from knives and kettles and axes and muskets and gunpowder, Chinese porcelain. We call that stuff China today because that's where it was coming from. Tea coming out of China, a whole just wealth of textiles, so many different types of textiles coming from literally all over the world. There's all sorts of wool coming out of Britain and France, so many different grades of wool that we are totally unfamiliar with today. There were silks and printed cottons coming out of China and from India and Indonesia. So there's stuff coming from all over the world, and those trade goods were all coming first to Montreal and then out here to Michilimackinac because they were being used to buy furs. All of those goods are things that the Anishinaabe and other indigenous people out here in the Great Lakes wanted. And so you can think about all those trade goods. You're looking, at a canoe here. Look, the cargo of this canoe. Don't think about this as barrels and boxes, and those kind of tan boxes up against the canoe are actually linen wrapped bales of stuff. They're kind of like the cardboard boxes of the 18th century. Think of all that as just a big pile of money, because that was how it was being used. These things were being shipped out here. Again, they would come through the river system. There was kind of a northern route that went up the Ottawa River from Montreal that you could get into the Mattawa River, which would flow into Lake Nipissing. From there, you could take the French River down into Georgian Bay on the east side of Lake Huron, and then follow the coast over here to Michilimackinac. You could also just continue on through Lake Ontario, Lake Erie, and then up Lake Huron. But all those goods were moving in canoes. Again, the canoe du maître, and pardon my French, I don't really speak French very well, but this is the master canoe. That's literally what it translates as. It's about 40 feet long, and every summer there would be dozens and dozens of these things paddling out here from Montreal, as well as bateaux, which were essentially 20 to 30 foot long rowboats packed with literally tons of those trade goods. Merchants like Solomon would be sending a couple of canoes at a time, packed with these trade goods. They would buy up the trade goods, send it all out here. They'd get to Michilimackinac, and Michilimackinac is then a distribution center for smaller satellite posts all over the Western Great Lakes. So Sault Ste. Marie was one. St. Joseph, or what we know as Niles, Michigan today, was another. There are things over in Green Bay. There are satellite posts at what would become Chicago and at Milwaukee. And so these trade goods would come here to Michilimackinac. Merchants like Solomon would basically supervise the transshipment. So taking it out of one canoe, these big 40-foot long master canoes, and reloading it into slightly smaller canoes, north canoes that were maybe only 25, 30 feet long. And those smaller canoes would then fan out all across the Great Lakes, taking those trade goods out to indigenous communities. Wherever they were native people, that's where they were going. And they were going to use this stuff, as I mentioned, basically like cash to buy furs from those indigenous people. There's a huge demand for fur in Europe at this time because of the fashion industry. And some of it was being used for cuffs and collars, stuff like that. But the vast majority of furs were being used for hats. So if you think about like Benjamin Franklin or George Washington, think about the hats that those people are wearing. If you're a Euro-American man in the 17th and 18th century, those triangular, tri-cornered hats that they were wearing, those are made out of fur. And the best fur comes from the beaver. There is also a huge demand for everything from muskrat and otter and mink, but beaver is the primary driver of the fur trade. So these trade goods would be used to purchase furs from those indigenous trappers. It's not Europeans who go out and actually trap the animals. It's native men who do the trapping. Native women then prepare the skins for trade. They sell those furs to people like Solomon or people working for Solomon, who then bring all the furs back here to Michilimackinac. So it's a distribution center for trade goods. It's also a collection point for all of these furs coming from all over the Great Lakes. They're consolidated, packed up, put in the big canoes. The big canoes go back to Montreal. It's about a 750-mile trip. It takes about 6 weeks. From there, those furs could be loaded onto a ship, taken over to Europe, where they could be turned into hats. And this is an incredibly lucrative business. There are literally tons of trade goods, tons of furs that pass through Michilimackinac every single year. And this is the business that Solomon was in. Not just sending out these trade goods, but also supplying the canoe crews. That was a whole business unto itself. Solomon would have hired canoemen, voyageurs, the people who actually worked in the canoes. But he, like a lot of other people, had this whole other side of the business that was, again, kind of serving as the logistical support for this whole system. So not only would he have been supporting his own crews, he may have been purchasing corn, purchasing supplies, using his relations with the indigenous communities here to then turn around and sell to other merchants. Solomon seems to have stayed active in both sides of the business. There are some merchants here who just totally decided to forego the trade in furs and trade goods, and they went all in on just supplying other merchants. So again, it's a very lucrative business, and it truly is a global business. The trade goods that Solomon was buying were coming, again, from all over the world. Some of the trade knives, for instance, we like to talk about, that he would have been buying in bulk by the gross. The iron for the blades was coming from mines in Sweden. It was being forged into a blade in a factory, probably somewhere in England. The wood for the handle was being harvested somewhere on the west coast of Africa. And it's all assembled and shipped across the Atlantic and then ends up in a native person's hand somewhere in Wisconsin. And the furs that were used to buy that knife end up on top of someone's head, somewhere in Germany or somewhere else in Europe. So it is truly a global system that Solomon was participating in. Now, that system worked pretty well for Solomon and the other British merchants here for a couple of years. But as I mentioned before, the British were relative newcomers in the Great Lakes. Yes, they had defeated the French colonial government in Canada beginning in 1760, but they had really not defeated the much larger population of people who called the Great Lakes home, and that's the indigenous people, the Anishinaabe and a whole variety of other groups. And when the British came in, they instituted a variety of policies, partially out of racism, partially out of a desire to save money. They're fighting a world war that lasted 9 years. That's kind of expensive. And so they changed the way the fur trade worked. And it had a lot of negative impacts upon the indigenous people who were the source of all the furs. And so as you move through the early 1760s, there's a lot of British trade policies, a lot of British cultural policies that the Native people find very offensive. It's also just a real bad time for them. They had been fighting alongside the French in this larger war. They had been bringing home lots of infectious diseases with them when they came home from campaign. There was widespread famine. The early 1760s is just not a great time for the indigenous people of the Great Lakes. And as a result, this movement grew. It's partially a religious movement, partially a political movement to essentially get rid of the British because a few religious and political leaders basically started telling everyone, hey, if we get rid of the British, all this bad stuff's going to go away and we can go back to the way things were. So in the summer of 1763, there was this pan-Indian uprising here in the Great Lakes. And multiple British forts around the Great Lakes were attacked and captured. Here at Michilimackinac, that occurred on June 2nd. It's actually the King's birthday, George III's birthday. And the local Ojibwa were very smart about how they wanted to get rid of the British. They knew that they couldn't just outright attack the fort. It's got pretty high walls. There were about 30 British soldiers here at that time. They had muskets and cannon. So they played a game of Bagadaway outside the fort. Bagadaway is basically lacrosse, but without rules. So it's very high intensity, very exciting sport. The gates were left open. At a certain point, they basically tossed the ball near that open gate and all ran over like they were going to scoop it up and keep playing. And keep in mind, there's about 400 Ojibwa men playing this game right outside. Instead of continuing to play, they dropped the sticks, ran over to all the Ojibwa women who were watching the game, who passed out concealed weapons that they had been hiding under their clothing. Those Ojibwa men swept into the fort and basically started going after anyone who was British. They weren't interested in the French Canadians. They were only interested in the British soldiers and merchants. And here again, we see Solomon being lumped in with the British merchants. He had kind of a front row seat to all of this. The house where he was just inside the gate. We can't see it here. He actually was able to hide out in an attic of one of his neighbors. And so he survived the initial attack. As he was hiding up there, he actually watched as some of the Ojibwa and some of his own French Canadian neighbors actually broke into his house and stole his stuff. They looted his trade goods. He was taken prisoner later that day, but the local Odawa, another kind of one of the branches of the Anishinaabeg, stepped in and basically redeemed the surviving prisoners. There had been about 13 British soldiers and 1 British trader killed outright during the attack. Another 5 were killed later on. But thanks to the intervention of the Odawa, Solomon survives. He gets taken to L'Arbre Croche essentially as a prisoner of war almost immediately after the attack. It's an Odawa community there. While they tried to figure out what to do with him. But it's really interesting to see that business continued even when they were all prisoners. On June 6th, so this is 4 days after the attack, Solomon was a prisoner along with George Etherington, the commanding officer who was also captured. They were buying and selling things from one another, including an enslaved Native woman. They were still buying and selling even while prisoners of war. Eventually, all of those prisoners got shipped to Montreal under the protection of the Odawa, and they were released there. And so although Solomon survived, he and his business partners, those other men who were spread out around the Great Lakes, they lost about 18,000 pounds worth of trade goods, including that stuff that Solomon watched his neighbors steal from him. And that was by no means unique to Solomon. There were other British traders out here who had the same thing happen to them. They watched, in some instances, as their French Canadian neighbors literally pulled boards off of walls so they could break in and steal their stuff. So this uprising, it's sometimes called Pontiac's uprising today, was pretty successful, at least in the short term. The British were able to come back a year later in 1764. They had kind of changed their tune. They had adjusted a lot of their cultural and trade policies, not necessarily out of any sense of altruism or because they felt bad about any of this. They just didn't want to keep getting killed. They realized if they wanted to do business out here, they needed to make accommodations to the Anishinaabe and other indigenous people because they truly are the ones who control everything. And so the British were able to return in 1764. Solomon came back about a year later in 1765. And this is the first time where we can pinpoint where he was living at Michilimackinac. This map is drawn in 1765. And you can see the circle there on that row house. That's the house that he and Gershon Levy purchased together in 1765. And we know that because notarial records and deeds recording this property transaction, they weren't necessarily surveyed. We don't have like a benchmark or anything to go off of. So these deeds lay out in pretty great detail. This house is bounded on the one side by the house of so-and-so, and on the other side by the house of so-and-so. In front is the parade ground, which that's exactly what that big kind of tan open space right there is. And they bought this house together. They also bought, that came with a couple of other things. There was also a cabin and a stable. We're not sure where those were. Those don't appear to have been right here at Michilimackinac. They may have been somewhere else. But the house that he purchased was pretty typical of other houses here at Michilimackinac. It was divided into 2 rooms. And it appears that they lived in one of those rooms, and then the other was kind of a storeroom slash office for them. And again, that would be very common. You would see that same sort of setup in a lot of the other houses here at Michilimackinac. So once he was back here, Solomon continued to participate in the trade, typically sending 3 to 4 canoes himself out into the west. And like many of the merchants here at Michilimackinac, Solomon only lived here seasonally. He was only here in the summertime. He went back to Montreal in the wintertime because even in the 18th century, people realized that Mackinac City is not always the most fun place to live in the wintertime. I live here now and I can attest to that. So most of the time he went back to Montreal. He had another home there and then was just out here in the summertime supervising the transshipment of his goods. He did, however, at one point spend the winter beyond Lake Superior. He went out to Lake Nipigon on the north shore of Lake Superior in 1766-67, where he traded directly with the indigenous people living out there. And he actually became one of the most successful merchants to the native people of what was then considered the far west. So northern Minnesota, North and South Dakota, Western Ontario. He was pretty active in that area. Now, on one of those trips back to Montreal in 1769, he married a woman named Louise Dubois. Again, pardon my French. And together they had at least 5 children. Now, what's kind of interesting about that marriage is that Louise was very much Catholic and all of their children were raised as Catholics. And this provides kind of an interesting insight into Solomon's Jewish faith. There was, at this point in time, a small but active Jewish population in British Canada, as well as elsewhere in the American colonies. And Solomon appears to have been a pretty active and well-known member of that Jewish community in Canada. And we see this in a couple of different places. One of the first kind of concrete examples that we can see of this comes in May of 1775. On May 1st of that year, something called the Quebec Act went into force. That was an act of parliament that formally brought British Canada into the British Empire. It formally made all of this, all the Great Lakes, part of Quebec province. Prior to that, it had just kind of been occupied territory. And it granted a lot of civil rights to French Canadians. And a lot of the British residents of Montreal did not care for that. They thought it was too permissive of those French Canadians, not least of which because most of those people were Catholic and those British merchants were absolutely not Catholic. And so there was some protest against the act. This, by the way, is also one of what's known in the United States as the Intolerable Acts. It really has nothing to do with the American colonies. It just so happened to be passed at the same time. But in any case, so on May 1st, it goes into effect. And when the residents of Montreal woke up on the morning of May 1st, they found that the bust of George III, that was kind of mounted at the place to arms in this central location in the city, had been defaced. And you're looking at the head of this bust here. It had its face blackened. There was a rosary made out of potatoes strung around its neck, and someone had hung a sign on it that essentially said, "Behold your popish king." Again, someone was really upset about the civil rights being extended to French Canadian Catholics. And the British officers in Montreal were very upset about this, who had besmirched this bust of the monarch. And there was a lot of consternation who would have done this. And apparently there was a man who at one point, without any evidence whatsoever, basically said, well, a Jew must have done it. And Solomon heard that and took offense and asked him to repeat himself. And when he continued to make anti-Semitic remarks, Solomon apparently punched him hard enough to knock him down and was briefly arrested for assault. He didn't appear to suffer any ill effects from that arrest. He doesn't appear to have been jailed or fined or anything like that. But again, even though Solomon is considered by most to be just another British trader, we do get these senses that he, again, was proud of his Jewish faith and his heritage coming from Germany and his role as part of that community. In 1778, he was active in the Shearth Israel congregation in Montreal. That had been founded a little bit earlier in the 1760s, but it was undergoing some reorganization in the late 1770s. And he assisted with the writing of some bylaws. He purchased 2 Torahs that were used regularly. And then one of those 5 children that he had, we unfortunately don't know this boy's name. He died in 1778. And again, he had been born and raised Catholic. He had been baptized as a Catholic. And Solomon asked the leadership of the synagogue if it would be all right to bury his son in the Jewish cemetery in Montreal. And that caused a little bit of debate because this child had not been raised in the Jewish faith. But because of Solomon's standing within the congregation and within the community, they made an exception for him and they allowed his son to be buried there with the understanding that this was a one-time only thing. They weren't going to make that exception for anyone else. But again, that kind of speaks to Solomon's role within that religious community. Now, today, people will ask us, do you find lots of evidence of his Jewish faith here at Michilimackinac? And we really don't. And that's because he probably took it with him. I mean, think of anything that's important to you at your house. If you've ever moved, you probably take that stuff with you. His home here was not just abandoned. He didn't just leave things sitting around. And so any of those things that were important to him, he probably kept with him and he kept moving around. We do know that he had a set of prayer books. Those came up at auction a couple years ago. Unfortunately, we weren't able to acquire them. But again, there is this evidence that he was active in the Jewish community in Canada. Now, his role in the community here also kind of speaks to how much he had also assimilated into the larger British Franco culture here at the Straits and elsewhere in Canada. Again, he was doing that seasonal thing, living here in the summertime, going back to Montreal in the wintertime. His partner, Gershon Levy, kind of disappears from the historical record around 1768. We don't really know a whole lot about what happened to him after that. But Solomon, again, continued living out here, working out here every year. Again, just to show how much a part of this community he was, in 1778, the residents of Michilimackinac, both French Canadian and British, sent a petition to the governor of British Canada, basically asking to restore a priest to Michilimackinac. There had been Jesuits out here until 1765, when the Jesuit order was suppressed, and the congregation, the Catholic congregation here, had been without a priest for over a decade at that point. And basically they were asking, could you please have a priest sent back out here to tend to our religious needs? And so Solomon signed that petition. He even pledged money to bring a Catholic priest out here, again, basically as just part of the larger community, thinking that this would be good for the community in which he was a part. A year later, in 1779, he partnered with many of the other merchants to create a general store, basically to kind of make sure everything ran smoothly, to cut down on competition. Because again, there aren't really companies at this point in time. There's lots of either these small groups of people, like Solomon started off working with his relatives and some of their friends. But there was a real potential for just rampant competition. And so by forming this general store, Solomon and the other merchants were looking to basically streamline their activities, make sure that everybody stood a chance to profit. And again, through the 1770s, he continued sending out canoes, continued buying and selling supplies, just like many other of kind of, I'd say, the medium-sized merchants out here. He wasn't a small-scale merchant, but he was by no means the largest merchant operating here at Michilimackinac. Now, at about this same time, we are talking about the era of the American Revolution. And beginning in 1779, the British government here at Michilimackinac decided to move from the mainland over to Mackinac Island. They thought that it was easier to defend because the American rebels had been enjoying some success in Illinois. There was also a fear of the Spanish, who controlled everything west of the Mississippi. The Spanish had thrown their lot in with the French, who were supporting the Americans by that point in time. And so they made this decision beginning in 1779 to just literally pick everything up and move it over to Mackinac Island and build a new fort and community over there. Now, many buildings were taken apart and moved and then reassembled. Lots of military buildings, many of the civilian homes were also moved over there. The row house in which Solomon was living at that time was not one of them. That house got demolished rather than being moved. And again, here's one of those reasons that we don't see too many personal objects, because it's not like that house just cataclysmically blew down or anything like that. Solomon moved. He took anything that he wanted to take with him and moved over to Mackinac Island. And in about 1780, 1781, as this larger move of the community was underway, he actually permanently relocated his entire family to Mackinac Island. And so they moved from Montreal. His wife and his children came out here as well. They remained active in the Catholic community on the island. His wife was a leader of the Catholic congregation at St. Anne's Church, which is still around over there today. 1784, Solomon became part of a very small committee. It was only 7 or 8 people who, again, were trying to put forth regulations to just monitor trade and make sure that everything ran smoothly. And Solomon continued in business with several of his sons. Again, these are the ones that we know their names of. He did also have a daughter, but Guillaume or William, Samuel, and Ezekiel Jr. all went into the fur trade. All of his sons had relationships with Indigenous women. Guillaume in particular seems to have fathered children with at least 3 different Indigenous women. But that's all part of the business. Building these personal connections, building these family relationships is how these merchants were able to be successful. It's a whole lot easier to do business with your relatives than it is with strangers. And unfortunately, we're unsure of the exact date, but Ezekiel Solomon probably died sometime around 1805, perhaps as late as 1808. And he was, again, buried in Montreal at the cemetery there. So that ends Solomon's life, but that does not end his legacy by any means. He is still an active presence at Michilimackinac today. There's a historical marker right outside our visitor center, so you can't miss this as you come inside. This historical marker noting him as Michigan's first Jewish settler went up in 1964. And the house that he lived in was excavated as part of our ongoing archaeological program between 1983 and 1988. If you've not been to Michilimackinac before, again, because everything was either moved over to Mackinac Island or was purposely destroyed around 1781, we have a pretty well preserved archaeological site here, and that site has always been protected as a park going back even to the 1850s. And so in the 1950s, we started an archaeological program here, which is still going today. And we are very slowly excavating more and more of the fort. And as excavations in certain areas are complete, we rebuild. And so after this part of the row house, this isn't the whole thing, it's the house with the green shutters, by the way. This is actually 2 units of the row house in which Solomon lived. There are 3 more units that have not yet been reconstructed. But this house went up in 1989. We were able to preserve some of the the larger archaeological remnants of the house. So it's kind of hard to tell what it is because it's really hard to take pictures of. But the picture on the left is actually looking down into a preserved cellar that was discovered under the house. There are artifacts down there that we've left in situ, so they're right where the archaeologists found them in the 80s. And you can actually look down into Solomon's cellar and see what he was storing down there in the 18th century. We'll look at the exhibits in just a second, but again, this is something that people can explore every day when we're open. For a while, there were pretty regular family reunions of Solomon descendants. Again, I mentioned his sons all had multiple children. Those people would come back semi-regularly. Some of them actually helped with the excavations in the 80s. And so it's something that people are still definitely aware of. Now, inside the house, there are two sections. Again, I mentioned the house had 2 rooms historically. One we've got set up as a period setting. So this is what it looked like before, representing what kind of the storeroom and office may have looked like. You can see we have some panels in there. These panels are a little bit older though. Some of the stuff is just looking a little bit tired because it's been in there for about 30 years. And so earlier this spring, the Jewish Historical Society reached out to us and asked again if we would be interested in collaborating on something to mark Solomon's arrival here in 1761. And we pretty quickly identified a refresh of at least part of the Solomon Levy house as a pretty good avenue to mark that. And so again, they very generously agreed to support this effort financially. And that allowed us to get some new interpretive panels in there. Those old panels were old cut vinyl. They were kind of showing their age. We were able to get new panels that are kind of in keeping with the new aesthetic that we're using on exhibit panels throughout the fort here. And the big thing was all of the trade goods that you see kind of scattered around this room. Those are all new. I know it doesn't look like much, those bales, but those are made out of a more appropriate material. It's not just canvas anymore. Looking at these ones, all these bales that you see here, those are just bales of straw wrapped in canvas. They give they give a good impression of what those trade bales would have been, but they're problematic for a couple of reasons, not least of which they are a pest vector. We are an outdoor museum and you've got big bales of straw. That's a great place for mice and voles and all other sorts of little tiny animals to make their homes in the wintertime, which obviously you don't want to have in a museum. So we were able to actually upgrade our bales to inert materials that will basically be pretty robust for a very long time. We got all new textiles. Again, I mentioned textiles were the most common trade good, a whole universe of textiles that we are totally unfamiliar with today, but to really represent the incredible diversity of things that Solomon was dealing with and how connected he would have been as part of this larger global fur trade. And so again, we kind of freshened this space up a little bit. Again, got these new panels in here. And again, this is just phase 1 of something that we at Mackinac State Historic Parks have identified as part of our long-term strategic plan in the next few years. And that's to actually address the rest of the house. You're only looking at that first room. There's another exhibit gallery in there. And you can see there's not a whole lot wrong with it. But again, it's about 30 years old. It's looking a little dated. It could use a refresh. The artifacts you see in those cases over there all came from the house. They were excavated there in the 80s. All trade goods that Solomon was probably handling himself in the 1760s and the 1770s. So to upgrade those exhibits is something that we are looking forward to doing. And also installing climate control for that cellar. What you see on the left here, this big glass box, it's as environmentally sealed as we can. There's another portion of the wall that is preserved that we can't really see right now because there's other things stacked in front of it for winter storage. But what we're looking forward to doing down the road is involving climate control or installing climate control so we can truly preserve those archaeological elements and make sure that they are accessible and viewable for all of our visitors for years to come. Probably even involves redesigning that case for the cellar that you see there on the left a little bit. And I mentioned it's kind of hard to take pictures of it because you can't actually get your head over it. Every time I want to look down there, I forget and I bump my head into the glass because you can't look right down into it. So those are things that we're looking forward to doing in the near future here. Again, our park system is quite large. We've got lots of other museums, but this is definitely on our radar to continue this work in Ezekiel Solomon's house to ensure that his story continues to be told as part of the larger story that we're telling here at Michilimackinac. So again, I'd just like to thank everyone at the Historical Society for initiating this whole thing. This has been very enjoyable to work on. I was pretty heavily involved in the exhibits out there, as well as obviously this presentation. And at this point, if people do have questions, I'm happy to answer.
If you have any questions, please submit them via the chat feature or via the Q&A feature, and I will happily moderate them for Craig. And we already did have one come through. Was there slavery on Mackinac, either native or African?
Yes, both. And I briefly touched on that, with Solomon selling that enslaved Indigenous woman to Etherington. It's very common. Many of the people here would have owned one other person. Most of those enslaved people were Native Americans. They always significantly outnumbered enslaved people of African descent, but yes, there were both here.
Are there any Solomon descendants living in the area right now?
Not in the area that I'm aware of. But again, the family appears to have gotten very large within just a generation or two of Ezekiel himself. I know I was running across, it may have been a family group from Nova Scotia, and they all traced their lineage back to Ezekiel Solomon. And there are groups like that I know in many other places.
Another viewer is wondering what connections and communication processes were used to get men in Berlin to come to Michilimackinac.
So it wasn't necessarily so much a recruiting thing. They weren't, nobody was actively going there and saying, hey, it's not like the gold rush where there are promoters, telling people to come on out here. It really does appear that Solomon and his partners saw an opportunity. Again, we unfortunately don't know a whole lot about his early life, but that was of their own volition, seeing an opportunity. There's this chance for them to go into business. If they're enterprising young men with some initiative and a little bit of credit, everything runs on credit in the 18th century, they could stand to make a lot of money. And again, they are by no means the only people who did that. There are other British merchants out here who did the exact same thing. That's how they got their start, coming from England, from Ireland, working as sutlers. Some of them kind of stayed on in that capacity, but it's a good entree into this business world out here, because you're starting to build connections with government officials, starting to build connections with indigenous groups who will probably be pretty good business partners down the road.
What is the charge if you would like to visit where you guys are in Mackinac?
Yeah, so Colonial Michilimackinac, we open in just under a month. We open on May 5th, and it's $12.50 for adults.
Does Solomon have any surviving Jewish descendants, or are they all of other faiths now?
I don't know. Again, everything that I have seen just, repeatedly states that he remained active in the Jewish community. His children, again, as I mentioned, they were all raised as Catholics. And I don't know that any of them attempted to, reconnect with their father's Jewish heritage at all.
A couple of comments have come through. One says that there's a woman named Mary McMaster June of Sault Ste. Marie, who is a direct descendant, Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan. And another said her late husband, Gene Curtis, was the Mackinac Island Commissioner in the 1980s.
Okay. Yeah.
If there are any other questions, please submit them via the chat or the Q&A feature. We'll just wait a second to see if anything else comes through. Okay, I don't see any more questions. Thank you, Craig, for joining us tonight. This was very, very informative and very, very interesting. And I think a lot of us who have not had the opportunity to visit are excited to do so as soon as we can. I know I would love to take my kids up there just to see the fort. Oh, we did have another question come through, it looks like. Let's see. Did his relatives in the business all intermarry?
You mean the other men
Yeah.
who? Okay. I'm not entirely sure, but I would not be surprised if they did. That was incredibly common for European men to start relationships, whether they were formalized in a church or not, with Indigenous women. There's actually a phrase in French, which again, I won't try and say it in French, but it's marriage in the manner of the upper country. And it basically is a civil union. Everybody realizes that those two people are together. They probably have children. And again, it's part of a power relationship that ends up going both ways. It's very easy to see it as exploitative on the part of the white men, basically just using these women for power connections. And in some ways, it truly is. But in other ways, those women's families are also benefiting from that. And they are being strategic about those relationships as well, because just as much as that British trader is getting a business partner, so are the other members of that woman's family. And again, we see that a lot. Some of them do appear to be very transactional. There's a lot of instances where these relationships will exist out here, and then the man will just leave and then go formally marry a Euro-American woman somewhere else. There are other times where they stay together. Contemporaneously with Solomon, there are people who, British men, Indigenous women who form these incredibly long-lasting relationships. One of his neighbors was potentially a man named David Mitchell, who was a medical officer, not really an officer, but he was kind of the surgeon's mate for the British military here. He married an Anishinaabe woman whose anglicized name was Elizabeth, and they were happily married for like the next 50 years. So again, that would be very, very common. It just might differ in what form it took and how formalized it was.
Do the Native Americans who live around the fort now still sell furs?
No, the fur trade in the Great Lakes really went strong, as I mentioned, for 150, 200 years. But by the 1830s, since they had been trapping in the Great Lakes Basin for about 150 years at that point in time, if not a little longer, the animals just weren't here anymore. They had to go farther and farther west, farther and farther north, so like out to the Canadian Rockies. And Mackinac just didn't make sense anymore as a center, as a logistical center, as a distribution, and as a collection point. I mean, there are still commercial fur traders today on a much smaller scale, but not really here as much. It is important, I think, to note that the Anishinaabeg are still here, though. They were not removed. Some of my Odawa colleagues are very adamant, that's what they want people to know. We're still here. They didn't go anywhere. They just, like everybody else, kind of transitioned to other forms of business.
We have a couple of questions about the route from the fort to Montreal,
Mhm.
the water route specifically.
Yeah.
Could you review what that was again?
Yeah, so there's a couple. A lot of them would go this northern route, which just upstream from Montreal in the St. Lawrence at a place called Lachine. That's where the Ottawa River flows into the St. Lawrence. And so Lachine, which is kind of a suburb of Montreal, that's where these canoe brigades would get started. They would paddle upriver. So when they're coming out here, part of the time they're going against the current. They go up the Ottawa River, up the Mattawa River, which flows into the Ottawa. That would get them to Lake Nipissing, which is a large lake on the east side of Lake Huron. Then they would take the French River down into Lake Huron and then coast. So basically staying along the shoreline. And again, that's a pretty straight shot, more or less east-west from here. And canoes made that trip pretty regularly. Bateau made that trip pretty regularly. The southern route is to just stay in the St. Lawrence, coast along the shore of Lake Ontario to Niagara, take the Niagara portage. That's why, as I mentioned, there's a pretty large European presence there at both ends of the river, at Fort Niagara on the north end, and there's a smaller community at the south end, and then follow Lake Erie across to Detroit, and then up Lake Huron to Michilimackinac. And they both seem relatively common. Of course, going at least from like Michilimackinac to Detroit, and then Detroit over to what became Fort Erie, which is right across from Buffalo, you can use sailing vessels. And so there were a small number of sailing ships on the Great Lakes making that, and then connecting, taking the portage road around the falls down to Lake Ontario and loading into other vessels, getting to Montreal that way.
Was there a synagogue at the fort?
There was not. Um, uh, Solomon is, as far as we know, apart from Levi, the only Jewish resident here for quite some time. Again, there is the congregation in Montreal, which shares its name with a much larger one in New York City, which is still active today. That establishment still exists in Montreal today. It's moved buildings several times, but it is still the same continuous organization as existed in Solomon's time. But out here, no.
Do we know what happened with the descendants of Chapman Abraham?
I'm not sure. I haven't extensively looked at that. Again, this is, we see those names thrown out as part of this loose consortium. But since he wasn't here, I know I personally haven't focused a lot of my research towards him. More kind of focused on Solomon himself, because we do see him, although there are details missing, there's a lot of details missing about his life. We do see him pop up in a lot of different places, whether it's on that petition to bring a priest here, whether it's on trade records. And what's kind of interesting is that although he was, I mean, he came speaking a different language. He was speaking German. He's coming from a different religious background. No one seems to have made too much of that. They noted, yes, he is a Jewish traitor, and that was about it. He, again, if anything, he would have been considered a British traitor, just like many of the other residents.
Was there any anti-Jewish sentiment towards Solomon that you've seen in your research?
Not directed at him directly. Again, the only interaction that we see is that incident in Montreal where he punched that guy for basically making anti-Semitic remarks. Those weren't apparently directed at him. He just overheard them. It wasn't he wasn't that other person wasn't trying to provoke him, but he was offended and stepped in. Not really. Again, because it does seem that he was considered just part of the British community here, because his wife was French Canadian, because she was Catholic, because his children were all raised as Catholic. It's not to say that it didn't happen by any means. It's just I've not seen records of it. But again, there's a lot about most people here at Michilimackinac that we just can't know their day-to-day experiences. But not that I've seen. There would have been always just kind of that low level, I guess, anti-Semitic feeling just in general. But whether that was elevated beyond kind of not the normal level, but what people would have been experiencing on a pretty regular basis, I don't really see evidence of that here.
If there are any other questions, please submit them via the chat or Q&A feature now. Well, I don't see anything else coming through. So again, thank you, Craig. This was really informative, really interesting. And as I said before, I think all of us are really excited to come up and see the fort and see Ezekiel Solomon's house and experience in person everything you've been able to show us tonight. Thank you everyone for attending. We really appreciate your continued participation in our programs and hope you will join us for one of our upcoming programs as well. Good night, everyone.
Good night.